Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to walk through the Policy Communication Toolkit. If you're interested, the link to the toolkit is in the chat box now. So my name is Sarah Harris. I'm a policy analyst here at PRB, Population Reference Bureau, in the International Programs Department. I manage the Policy Communication Fellows Program, which incorporates many of the same resources available in the Policy Communications Toolkit. I also support our family planning and reproductive health policy and advocacy work. Reshma Nayak is here with us as well. She's a senior policy analyst. Let me get the presentation started. Yes, so Reshma is here with us as well. She's a senior policy analyst here at PRB and has trained many advocates and researchers using the Policy Communications Toolkit. Nicole LaGrone is also with us. She's a program associate at PRB and has supported past Policy Communication Fellows programs. She'll provide any technical support as we go through the webinar. So again, if you have any issues, let us know in the chat box. A little bit about Population Reference Bureau. PRB informs people around the world about population health and the environment and empowers them to use that information to advance the well-being of current and future generations. We stand on 3 pillars: inform, empower, and advance. So welcome to the webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Reshma to introduce the Policy Communication Toolkit.
All right, so I'd like to now start by giving you a brief introduction to the toolkit. First off, the toolkit was developed as a resource to help researchers and advocates learn about and bridge the gap that commonly exists between research and policy action. This research to policy gap exists for a number of different reasons, and evidence shows that there are ways to overcome the gap if the right approaches are used. But these approaches are not commonly taught or discussed in academic or research settings. So the toolkit breaks down the foundation of the gap into 4 categories. Number 1, individual differences between the academic and research community and policymakers. Second, institutional roadblocks between the 2 groups. Then poor communication, and finally practical constraints. And we at PRB see that there are 3 main strategies to bridge this gap, and these strategies are emphasized throughout the toolkit, namely planning for research uptake from the outset, engaging policymakers throughout the research process, and finally communicating evidence and research strategically. And this last one is an area where the toolkit really strongly focuses. So we believe that there's a really great window of opportunity to effectively communicate research to inform policy. And the skills that we're teaching and that are taught throughout the toolkit can help individuals open and leverage that window. So the Policy Communications Toolkit is a publicly available resource that provides a comprehensive evidence-based training curriculum that can be customized to suit your needs. The toolkit has 8 learning modules, which each include PowerPoint presentations, facilitator guides, hands-on exercises, suggestions for supplementary activities, and also sample workshop agendas. So you can use the Policy Communication Toolkit to teach participants about a number of things. For example, teach about the process by which research informs the policy environment, how to identify key policy audiences, how to identify and communicate the policy implications of research, and finally how to communicate messages using a variety of formats and platforms, including policy briefs, oral presentations, data visualizations, social media, and more. So some of you may be wondering, why yet another toolkit? Indeed, there are many existing resources available out there to support advocacy and communication. However, we've heard repeatedly from trainees over the years that there's a demand for this kind of product. Participants really wanted to be able to share the skills they had learned during the traditional policy communications training with their other colleagues and partners. So here it is, and we really hope the toolkit will easily allow users to further expand the reach of these tools beyond those who participate in the one-off training. Again, the toolkit is available free of charge online, allowing open access to these resources, which are applicable for family planning policy advocacy and beyond. Finally, of course, the toolkit allows us at PRB to strengthen and support our existing partnerships with regional and national organizations. So just to give you a bit of background, PRB has trained researchers, experts, and advocates to bridge the gap between policy and research for well over 30 years. And the hallmark of PRB's approach to policy communication training is the Policy Communication Fellows Program, which was founded in 1987 with funding from USAID. And PRB still continues to train and mentor doctoral students from developing countries to influence policies for lasting change. The Fellows Program includes a skills-building workshop, which incorporates components of this toolkit, a year of mentorship with senior PRB staff, and interaction with global research to policy experts. The core goals of the program are to instill participants with, one, an understanding of the process by which research informs the policy environment, and two, the skills to use different formats and platforms to communicate research to policy audiences in a way that encourages action. In addition to the doctoral fellowship, over the years, PRB has partnered with various types of organizations in several different countries to offer 1- or 2-week policy communication training for groups of advocates or researchers. The Policy Communication Toolkit modules are customizable for these types of settings and for the specific audience and the purpose of the skills building sessions. One important thing to note is that the toolkit frequently cites or references family planning and reproductive health issues and examples, especially in relation to contraceptive method choice. However, I do want to remind you that the toolkit is not at all limited to use in this topic area. The core skills in the toolkit apply no matter what discipline of research or topic that you're talking about, and the topic-specific content can easily be adapted to suit other issues. So just to let you know about how the toolkit sort of came about, the current toolkit reflects a lot of work that was done in 2016 by PRB experts. First, they updated and revised our curriculum to reflect the latest literature and best practices in evidence-based policymaking. And second, they expanded the curriculum to address skills that are increasingly crucial for modern advocates, including modules on negotiation and accountability, communicating research through social media, and finally data visualization. So in the new Negotiations and Accountability module, participants can learn how to negotiate policy commitments and how to track and monitor a commitment through implementation. They also learn how to adapt their approach in the negotiation process, with a particular focus on influencing budget changes with ministries of finance. This session is particularly valuable for advocacy efforts to hold policymakers accountable for their commitments. The other new module, Communicating Research Through Social Media, introduces participants to the most common social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and blogging. Participants learn how to tailor social media messages using evidence-based content and how to identify target policy audiences for social media dissemination. And then there's the data visualization module, which introduces participants to the key principles of telling a story with data. Presentations cover the principles of data visualization, including why data visualization can boost comprehension, and it also includes several key design principles. So now I'll hand over to Sarah, who will walk us through the toolkit.
Great, thank you, Reshma, and thank you for introducing the toolkit. So what's included in each module? The toolkit provides users with a comprehensive package of materials, both instructional and interactive, that will support the facilitation of training programs based on the specific needs of participants. Each module of the toolkit includes between 5 and 10 individual sessions, and a session is composed of instructional presentations, and those come complete with speaker notes, activities and assignment worksheets that are applicable for small group settings, facilitator guides with instructions for moderating each session or activity. It also has answer keys and suggestions for guiding a group discussion, required reading assignments for participants, and supplementary activities such as outside speakers or site visits. So one of the features of the curriculum is that we want participants to apply the skills immediately to their own work. When we carry out our workshops, we always ask participants to come with an advocacy topic or research finding that they're working on. And throughout the workshop, we ask them to apply the skills that they're learning in the workshop directly to that activity, directly to that research or advocacy topic, through products like a policy brief, presentations, data visualizations, and so on. The worksheets and facilitator guides include everything to assign those activities. Reshma introduced 3 of our newest modules, but the toolkit actually includes 8 modules in total. From research to policy, strategic communication, writing for policy audiences, creating policy presentations, negotiations and accountability, communicating research through social media, data visualization, and working with the media. And as you'll see, modules are frequently referred to by their abbreviation throughout the toolkit. Content included in the first 2 modules, from research to policy and strategic communication, provides a conceptual underpinning for how to communicate data and evidence to the policy audiences. This is really the meat of the toolkit. In Module 2, strategic communication, participants are taught how to use data for advocacy, and the subsequent modules focus on building those communication skills for whichever medium. Now we will walk through how to easily navigate the toolkit. Feel free to follow along on the toolkit website. And as a reminder, the link to the toolkit website is available in the chat box if you're interested in following along. So if you scroll about halfway down on the home page, you'll find a list of all 8 modules. This is the launch pad of the toolkit. You can always come back here to the home page to access all of the modules and the materials. By clicking Module 1, you'll access 3 sections: description, components, and supplemental activities. Each module is organized into these 3 sections. And today we're going to walk through Module 2, strategic communication, as an example. If you're following along on the website, go ahead and click Module 2, strategic communication, and click the description tab to open the description box. The description section of each module provides an overview that summarizes the various contents of each module. You'll also find learning objectives, which detail what participants should be able to do as a result of the module. For strategic communication, participants will learn how to identify a policy change goal, write communication objectives, and much more. Each description section will also list the training products that participants will have developed during the session. In this case, participants will develop a communication strategy, evidence-based policy messages, and a 60-second soundbite of their research. And finally, each section contains a link to a zip folder which has all of the materials necessary for that module. The second tab of each module is the components section. For those following along, go ahead and open the Components tab. Each module contains a combination of components: instructional presentations, group exercises, and supplementary activities. So you'll note in the module format that presentations are always noted by an L in the abbreviation, exercises by an E, and supplementary activities by an A. And keep in mind the toolkit was developed to be used during training workshops and mini courses, among other small skills building sessions. So we've built in ready-made presentations that outline key concepts and skills, and have also suggested activities for participants to practice and apply those skills in addition to the instructional learning. And finally, we have group exercises for participants to share and receive feedback. We have found that allowing sufficient time for participants to truly apply these skills to their own research or advocacy topics facilitates the most valuable learning. As we go through this module, consider ways you might adapt these components for your own training. So let's dig deeper into the components section of Module 2. Module 2 is one of our longest modules. We have 9 sessions included for strategic communication. And you'll notice again the abbreviation. So Activity 1, SC1L, is a presentation denoted by the letter L. If you skip down to number 2, creating a policy goal and communication objectives and identifying audiences, it's denoted by an A. And this is an activity for participants to do individually during the workshop. If you skip all the way down to Activity 6, crafting evidence-based policy messages, you'll see the letter E, which means this is a group exercise that participants can work on in their small groups. When you have more time, I encourage you to click through each individual component of the module. But for now, let's check out the first one, SC1L. So scroll back to the top of the component section, and let's look at SC1L, Strategic Communication 1, Policy Goal, Audiences, and Objectives. For each component, the toolkit provides an estimate of the time you should allocate to complete the component. And for this activity, you should estimate about 30 minutes to complete. There are also hyperlinks to materials necessary to facilitate the component, and hyperlinks to required preparation when applicable. So let's go back to the presentation feature of the toolkit. If you click the presentation hyperlink, the slideshow for this component will automatically download. And if you're having trouble here at the download, you might consider downloading the zip file instead, which contains all materials under the description tab. This is a sample of the presentation that will download when you click the home screen. We've prepared fully populated presentations, and there you can see the populated slide deck on the side. Each slide has pre-filled content and also notes to assist with facilitating the presentation. The presentations are based on evidence-based approaches. Most presentations end with a slide that lists the sources used to create the presentation. And this is really a great resource if you or the participants are interested in learning more about the content discussed for the presentation. If you go back to the Components tab, you'll also see a link to the Facilitator Guide. And the guide details the format of the activity, whether this is a presentation, an exercise, or activity, the purpose, a description, key learning concepts, materials needed, additional exercises, and required preparation. So if you're going to facilitate a session, we suggest you first take a look at the Facilitator Guide as you prepare for moderating that session or activity. Participants for the policy communication trainings are expected to prepare in advance of each session. Some components will require participants to read materials or prepare an exercise prior to the session. For SC1L, as you'll see in the component session under required preparation, participants are asked to read 2 articles. By clicking the hyperlink under required preparation, users are taken to either the article website or a PDF. The final section of the module contains supplemental activities. If you're still following along, go ahead and click the Supplemental Activities tab. This section provides participants an opportunity to practice the key concepts learned during the module. Supplemental activities might be a worksheet to practice communicating evidence-based messages, a small group exercise, or even a presentation from policy or media experts. The supplemental activities are structured in a very similar fashion to the components. They each include an estimate of the time, components of the activity, and required preparation. And our past participants have really emphasized how these interactive applied activities reinforce the lessons they learned in the instructional portions. The activities often challenge participants to try a new task for the very first time, such as delivering a 60-second elevator pitch on a research topic in front of the entire workshop. We suggest organizing small working groups of about 3 to 5 participants at the beginning of the workshop. And the same groups should remain together, allowing a more intimate setting for participants to practice the activity as the workshop goes on. So let's take a look at supplemental activity under Module 2. If you click on the Facilitator Guide, a PDF of the Facilitator's Guide will automatically download. So again, ideally participants in your workshop will have chosen a research or advocacy topic to build on throughout the workshop. Participants in our Fellows program typically use their dissertation topic and have actually been able to use advocacy messages developed during the workshop for real-life policy change. In Module 2, participants learned about elements of strategic communication and completed 2 worksheets where they used their research to develop succinct, effective communication messages for a policy audience. For this activity, Working Group Session 1, they'll build on the earlier worksheet activities that they completed in earlier sessions. Participants focus on identifying a policy goal, policy audiences, and communication objectives, and also on developing messages with 3 key components: data, implications, and recommendations. Participants will come in having filled out these sections of the Elements of Strategic Communication worksheet. The facilitator should allow each participant to explain what they've done and, along with other group members, provide constructive feedback. And these instructions are available for each facilitator guide. So again, I stress it's very important to look at the facilitator guide before moderating a session so that you can get a sense for what materials are required and how to best facilitate the session. So that wraps up navigating through each session of Module 2. And all 8 modules on the home page are organized in this exact same fashion. So I'll turn over to the next session to Reshma to talk to us about how to plan a workshop.
All right, so if you're still following along, scroll to the top of the homepage and click the tab Planning a Successful Workshop. In this section, you'll find some good tips to help you plan and prepare for a workshop. And in the next slide, I'll go over a few of the especially important tips. So when you're ready to plan your own policy communication workshop, you really want to first consider what skills are most relevant for your participant group and how much time you'll have. So a good starting point is to look at the sample agendas that we have in the toolkit. We have samples for a 2-day workshop, a 5-day workshop, and even a 2-week workshop. And these can give you a sense of how you might fit key content into your allotted time period. Next, you want to really choose the modules that will sufficiently address the needs of your participants. So just note that using all 8 modules would require at least 2 weeks. So it's likely that you'll need to be very selective about what you choose, or that you'll want to complete different modules over the course of time. And one thing that we've learned through experience is that it's really better to focus on a few key issues or core modules and have them learn it well rather than overwhelm participants with too much information. Another thing I really would like to mention is that once you've selected your modules, you'll want to go through the content very carefully and decide if any of it needs to be adapted to suit your purposes or your audiences. Say, for example, if you're working on an issue different from family planning or reproductive health, you may want to adapt some of the examples or the readings or the exercises to suit that purpose. For example, I recently adapted the content for use with a group that was focused on child nutrition. But I do want to mention that this takes a fair amount of time and effort, so you'll definitely need to plan for that. Another thing that we've found in preparing for workshops is that providing binders is really critical. The binders would include all requisite materials for the workshop, and it really helps the participants to follow along. The binder of materials might include an agenda for the week, a consolidated list of modules with activities, presentation slides, reading materials, and exercises. I think Sarah has already mentioned the issue of preparing participants in advance, but this can't be underscored enough. It's really important that participants are aware of what's going to be happening during the workshop because a lot is expected of them, including homework, reading assignments, and doing exercises. In addition, many of the exercises ask participants to apply the skills to a body of research or advocacy topics that they're familiar with or that they're currently working on. So it's really important that for them to get the most out of the workshop, that they come to the training with the results of research or with an advocacy topic in order to really make the most of it. And finally, one thing we found is that inviting policymakers, experienced advocates, media representatives, and social media experts to facilitate some of the sessions or to serve as guest speakers can really be invaluable to the learning process, as it makes the learning a lot more practical. And you'll find in the facilitator guides, notes that mention which activities and which sessions for which these kinds of guests might be the most useful. So we've been focusing a lot on using this training curriculum for workshops, but there are a few other ways that it can be used, and I just wanted to mention a few of those. So for example, it could be used to hold a mini course on policy communication within an academic institution. In addition, individuals can use it for self-study. They could download the material, study the information, and even start applying the lessons to improve their knowledge and skills. Of course, we have talked about using the curriculum for a traditional workshop, and that works exceptionally well. And finally, it can be used to train a core set of trainers who will then conduct trainings with others over time. So finally, as we come to the end of this webinar, we want to let you know how PRB can support you. Of course, I want to emphasize that the Policy Communications Toolkit was designed for anyone or any organization to independently use it and to adapt it to suit their needs. It has all of the information that you need to do this. However, you might find that if you do find that you need more support and resources are available, it is possible that PRB could partner with you to help provide more support. So for example, we could coach a few of your senior staff on the content and how to facilitate a workshop so that they feel equipped to do it on their own. We could also consult on the workshop structure and relevant content, particularly if it needs adaptation for another topic. We could also collaborate with you to facilitate a workshop. And finally, we may be able to connect you with some of our alumni or other contacts in country who could serve as resource persons. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. And now we'd really like to hear from you. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And you can also contact us via email after this webinar. And aside from questions, we'd also like to hear from you how you might plan to use this toolkit or some of the ideas that you might have. So please feel free to share those in the chat box as well.
So we do have one question to start. Can the toolkit suit integrated approaches such as PHE? And that's a great question. Reshman touched on it briefly in her final slides, but the toolkit was created using family planning and reproductive health content and examples. But it's quite possible to apply these exact same skills from the toolkit to any policy content area. It does require preparation in advance, and we encourage facilitators to go through each section and update the articles, the reading in advance of each session so that it relates to that particular content area, and also to update the examples that are provided throughout the presentation so that participants can have a better idea of how those skills apply directly to a particular content area such as PHE. We've done it in the past, and maybe Reshma might talk about a little bit more of her experience adapting it to a nutrition audience, but it's possible. It just requires a fair amount of time in advance to update the materials.
Right. So this is Reshma, and I can just add, when we did do the adaptation for nutrition, it took a fair amount of time, and I'll say that the first 4 modules require a little more updating because those are the ones that tend to have more topic-specific references or examples. For example, Strategic Communications 2, which really teaches the core skills around messaging, has a number of different examples, and they're all sort of geared towards family planning and reproductive health. And if your audience is quite different from that, they'll probably sort of it'll register better if you use material that's more in their space. So it does take quite a lot of effort. You need to, as Sarah mentioned, replace the articles, the readings, Some of the exercises also refer to family planning and reproductive health. So I would say that you definitely need to allot a fair amount of time to adapt the materials to suit different topics. But the core skills are absolutely the same.
Great, thank you, Reshma. We received another question: how many participants were the materials developed for, given the time outlined in these resources?
Right. So I would say we typically try to limit our participants to, I'd say, a maximum of 16 people. The way that the sessions are structured, you have group exercises, you have groups coming back to present, and if you have a long enough time period, we also have individual presentations that are given at the end of, say, a one-week workshop. And so if you envision, having too many people in that kind of setting, it would be really unwieldy. And so we find that the learning really works best when you have a limited number, say 12 to 16 participants.
And I facilitated trainings in the past that had approximately 25 to 30 participants, and the training went well. One way we prepared in advance to kind of make it more approachable for the facilitators was having group leaders who were primed beforehand on the policy toolkit resources, and they were coached one-on-one on how to facilitate small group sessions on their own. So if your participant group happens to be longer, we suggest you do allocate more time, particularly for the group exercises and presentations, but also consider having senior staff or more advanced technical staff who can be coached in advance on how to facilitate the smaller exercises as well. And that'll make sure that all participants receive the same amount of feedback and have an opportunity to digest the material in a small group setting. So we received another question: would modules from the toolkit be useful within a leadership training course? I think there are specific modules that could absolutely be adapted to a leadership setting, depending on what the intended outcomes of the training are. If you're interested in how to communicate more effectively, there are great activities such as creating a 60-second soundbite and more interactive activities, giving a presentation that are in some of the earlier modules. So we encourage you to look through and kind of pick and choose which ones are most applicable to a leadership training. I will say most of these are most relevant for presenting before a policy audience or speaking with the media. And if you're trying to adapt some of those to more effective communication, which is probably more applicable to a leadership setting, it's doable, but we'd encourage you to modify some of the presentations and the activities accordingly. So we received another question: can the toolkit be used to train with the trainer acknowledging PRB, or does trainer need authorization to use it? And I think it's fine so long as the materials are in some way acknowledging PRB's recognition or recognizes PRB's contribution to the toolkit. We're fine with these materials being used for any sort of training, any sort of workshop. The reason that we created it and posted it online free of charge is that we want all implementing partners, organizations, universities, so on and so forth. We want different institutions to be able to use and adapt the toolkit for their purposes. We do ask that if you could to acknowledge PRB for creating the materials, but you don't need our authorization in advance. If you feel compelled to share, how the toolkit went in practice, to share maybe some challenges that you had, we'd love to hear feedback, but you absolutely do not need PRB's authorization in advance of planning a workshop. In Reshma's slide, she did mention that we can provide additional consulting to assist with preparing the workshop. So once you kind of get into the toolkit, you'll kind of get a sense that there's quite a bit of material included in the toolkit. We wanted to provide more in advance to allow participants to select which modules or which sessions are most appropriate to the outcomes of the workshop. But if you need further guidance, kind of parsing through and deciding which modules are most appropriate to your needs, or maybe even getting a better sense of the theoretical or conceptual framework used to create these modules, please do contact PRB and we can arrange some consulting services to assist.
Okay, we have another question as well. Someone has asked if we could advise if there is specific software or an online tool that can be used for population or reproductive health data visualization, something like Hans Rosling's Gapminder. So I will actually direct you back into the toolkit for the answer to this. In the part 2 of the data visualization presentation, you'll find, towards the end of that, you'll find a list of different websites, tools, and resources where you can go to start designing different types of visualization. So the toolkit actually does present a fair amount of information on that as a starting point. So I hope that you'll take a look at that module.
Okay, so another participant has asked, is there a diversity of participants, including policymakers? How do you go about developing the small groups? Do you aim to have them diverse or homogeneous? I think this, again, really depends on the intended outcome of the workshop. So the premier training program that we offer at PRB is our Policy Communication Fellows program. That's targeted towards doctoral students. It's a very small group, and they're selected through a pretty stringent application process. In that instance, it's a rather homogeneous group. They all are researching on a family planning or reproductive health topic. And we find in that setting that it creates I think, a learning environment that allows for more collaboration because the participants have a shared knowledge base. In the past, I personally have led policy communication training for advocates that had a different array of backgrounds. So some were focusing on HIV content areas, some people were focusing on family planning, and even some people were focused on nutrition. And in that space, we were able to organize small working groups around the same content area. But the participants all were advocates in some fashion. I think it's possible to include policymakers in a training. I would just encourage, depending on your workshop outcomes, I would encourage you to organize the small working group sessions such that participants have a shared knowledge base or a shared practice base. So maybe placing the policy makers in the same working group would allow for feedback that's possibly more pertinent to the sorts of work that they do. Reshma, what do you think about that?
Right. I just wanted to add that when it comes to the small working groups, if you have, say, 4 or 5 people in a working group, one of the things that we really emphasize is that the participants should be learning from each other as much as they're learning from us or as from the facilitators. So, and that can happen in different ways. We've found that sometimes having participants who have similar topics, so say even if broadly it's similarly family planning, reproductive health, but within that some may be working on adolescent health, school-based programs, different things like that. Those who are working maybe in a similar space but in different settings often have a lot to contribute to each other's work. Other times, obviously, learning can coming from different backgrounds because they may see things in a different way, may be able to shed light on issues that people aren't seeing. So, when you look at your list of participants, what you want to do is ask them, very specifically what their area of interest is, what the topic is that they're planning to work on during the workshop, and then just try to mix and match thinking about how best they can learn from each other. So I think that's what's really important when it comes to setting up the working groups.
Great, thank you. And thank you to everybody who's sharing the various opportunities that they are considering using the toolkit. We are excited to see that some of you are already thinking about ways that this is directly applicable to some of your upcoming work. We do provide support internationally, so our international department does work with organizations globally. And if you were interested, regardless of where you're based and working with PRB, definitely reach out to me, Sarah Harris, My email is up on the screen now, and in the follow-up email, you'll also have my contact information. Okay, let's go to the next question. So somebody asked if the materials can be used for local and grassroots community, maybe community advocacy or community development. Absolutely. We think depending on the skill level of your participants, you might consider modifying some of the examples or modifying some of the required preparation in advance. If you go through and review the materials, some of the articles might be a little bit too specific to family planning or might be too targeted towards maybe a research audience. And if you find that's the case, go ahead and update the various required preparation and the presentations to fit your audience. But we think the toolkit really, the heart of the toolkit is to help advocates, to help researchers, to help various audience groups communicate effectively. And part of that means communicating effectively before a policy audience or maybe before the media. But these exact same skills are applicable to different outcomes as well. And that's what we think. We hope that the toolkit can be used and customized by users for a variety of audiences. So we encourage you to go through and choose kind of which presentations, which activities are most relevant to your workshop outcomes or your training outcomes. And then go ahead and build in your own additional activities or examples or readings in advance to fit it to your particular workshop needs. But yes, we think it is applicable to local and grassroots communities.
Right, and I recently did do this training with a group of civil society organizations who were a lot more grassroots, smaller, working on the ground. And I think that the important thing there is to just really keep in mind what your end outcome is. In this case, these were grassroots organizations who were used to working with communities, but who wanted to expand their reach and their communication to affect changes at a higher level, whether it's programming, policies, or strategic investments. You know, and so it's really important to keep that in mind, because oftentimes the grassroots community has a difficult time identifying the policy level goals and things that are asked for within this kind of training curriculum. So it's just really important to keep in mind what exactly it is that you want them to get out of it. Is it about tweaking their messages to the community, or is it about sort of shifting the way that they communicate to other audiences? And if it's the latter, I think that that can be really useful and can work.
And I think that kind of gets to an additional question about how do you use the toolkit to create data for policy recommendations. For example, issues like adolescent reproductive health or family planning methods. Can I use this toolkit for policy recommendations? And we think this is an excellent toolkit, an excellent resource to do that exact thing. I think adolescent reproductive health falls very well in line with many of the examples that we've included in the toolkit. The modules, the early modules, particularly Module 2, Strategic Communication, walks users through step-by-step how to create policy messages. Now, creating the recommendations in advance does require a bit of work on the participants' end to think about how that research, how their research can apply to policy change. So we speak about the various steps in the policy process that can guide participants on creating recommendations that are relevant. But we're not as, the toolkit is not directly concerned with creating recommendations as much as it's more concerned with conveying those recommendations. So definitely take a look at what's included, particularly in Module 2, and see if that provides you enough context to develop some of the policy recommendations that you're looking for in terms of adolescent reproductive health and contraceptive methods.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that, I think what the toolkit does effectively when it comes to recommendations is to really keep our minds focused on what kinds of recommendations make sense related to the evidence that you're providing. A lot of times, you know, we come out with recommendations that seem to make sense, but then they don't follow necessarily from, the real problem at hand or the specific problem at hand. And so the training really lets participants kind of keep in mind, how do I create recommendations that fit the information that I'm giving? How do I create recommendations that are actually feasible, that might make sense? And how do I also back up my recommendations with information that will allow the sort of decision maker to feel confident about taking those recommendations? So there is a lot that is in the toolkit around, how to craft the right kinds of recommendations. So it can be helpful in that way.
We received a question asking about the acronyms for the various resources. Do you have a cheat sheet for easy reference? So that's a great question, and unfortunately at this time we do not have a cheat sheet available on the website, but I'll mark that for future updates if we're able to create some sort of a guide to make it easier to know which activities denoted by each abbreviation.
All right, so there's another question around someone is working on youth sexual and reproductive health and family planning in a developing country. They're working with school reproductive health and out-of-school youth, and are wondering which modules would be appropriate from the communications toolkit. I think, again, it always depends on your purpose and what outcomes you're looking for. If it's around learning how to communicate better, without knowing the details of this situation, I would say if you're actually working with youth who maybe are advocates or who are trying to get a specific message out, it may be useful to use the modules around communicating with the media. And prior to that, maybe just around crafting messages and learning how to get your point across succinctly, and then reaching out to the media. And of course, since it's youth, we have our modules on social media, which they may already be experts in, but if they're not, it's also a way to get them involved. And so those modules may be useful in terms of different ways of communicating a message.
We received another question about whether or not there's a workbook for individuals to use to complete some of their required preparation in advance of sessions. So we don't actually have a hard copy of a workbook. But what we do at PRB when we create our training agendas is to create our own binders, and that's as straightforward as it sounds. We print out all of the materials that the participants need, and that includes the required preparation, that includes all of the assignments that they have to do. It also has a guide to what the order of the presentations will be for the week. And we create these binders in advance so that it takes some of the confusion away from the participants and really allows them to focus in on what we expect from them day by day. And the trainings can be quite intensive, so oftentimes participants are asked to work in the evenings or through their meals to really kind of complete some of the homework assignments or the reading, so that we can really ensure that the learning is not only instructional, but also applied. So no, we don't have handbooks at this time, but we encourage you to print out binders or whatever format works best for you in advance of the workshop.
Okay, we had another question I don't think we've tackled yet around someone who's having a communications training for some partners during a reproductive health and rights session. And the person is looking for guidance on an angle to take to ensure participants get a sense of using communications in their work. He or she initially thought of walking them through developing a communication strategy, but found that a little boring. Yeah, so I would say that the strategic communications module, the strategic communications presentation 1 and 2, was our attempt at making a communication strategy less boring. We used to have a presentation on the strategy and got feedback that it was in fact boring. And so we tried to update this. And with the exercises and group activities that come along with it, I think it kind of brings it to light in a better way. Especially, you'll see, and Sarah has referenced it, the 60-second soundbite. Activities like that have been really popular with the training groups and kind of bring sort of less exciting material to life in a better way. So I would say to take a look at that particular module. It should still give you the content that you need, but it has a couple of ways to jazz it up.
Great. Are there any more questions? If not, we're going to wrap up the webinar. And again, thank you everyone who joined us and listened to us as we walked through navigating the Policy Communications Toolkit. It's great to hear that there are already some ideas percolating about how to apply the toolkit to some upcoming training. As we said earlier, please contact me, Sarah Harris, at sharris@prv.org if you have any questions or would like to follow up for some possible consulting to help your organization create workshops that really do support researchers, advocates in creating evidence-based advocacy messages. So with that, we're going to close out and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world. Take care.